Hello, my name is Mark Morton. I work for Mercia Group and I'm here today to present this short presentation on behalf of Kroner Taxwise. And what we're looking at in this short presentation relates to changes in rules relating predominantly to closed companies, I'd guess, not necessarily exclusively. Some is a tweak to existing rules, some is a new rule, and they are in a similar area. So we have two slightly different things going on here. The first is a change to a set of rules which gets referred to as transaction in securities. These rules are old. They've been around certainly throughout my career in various guises, and they're there to deal with specific transactions, as you might imagine, in shares or securities. Now, a transaction in securities historically has been defined as buying shares, selling shares, altering rights, share-for-share transactions, and so on and so forth. So for a lot of people, it was really the area of reconstructions, reorganisations, mergers, demergers, share-for-share exchanges, that sort of area where this set of rules comes in. A transaction in securities is fairly broad, as you might imagine, and what these particular rules do is say in certain circumstances, if there's a transaction in securities, the main purpose of which is to gain a tax advantage, then the legislation starts to kick in and say, well, actually, potentially what you've had on these transactions is a capital gain, and the legislation will convert it back to being a distribution. So if you can imagine a £1 million gain, potentially for a lot of people only subject to a 10% rate of tax after entrepreneurs relief, you would be saying actually for an additional rate taxpayer, I'm terribly sorry, that's not a 10% rate, that's 38.1% rate of tax as a distribution. So potentially a very big distinction. It's only in certain circumstances where these rules apply, and there have been no particular rules in terms of the sorts of particular breadth of the legislation, but one thing which has changed in a very mainstream way is that a transaction in securities historically did not generally cover the liquidation or winding up of a company, because there was a very old tax case many years ago that said a commercial liquidation was not within these rules. So over the years there have been many companies which have reached the end of their natural life. The taxpayer decides to wind the company up. These days possibly liquidate it as well because of the way the tax rules work, take that money as a capital gain and walked away with their entrepreneurs relief on that. I suspect there aren't many firms out there who have actually got a clearance from the transaction in securities rules, and in many respects never needed because of that old tax case and because the revenue generally acknowledged that liquidations were not within these rules. There are a number of little kind of alterations to the legislation this year, but the primary one in my mind is actually liquidations and capital reduction schemes are brought specifically within the rules for distributions on or after the 6th of April this year. So for many people, maybe something that they might have encountered in a quite specific situation, liquidations winding up becoming a much more kind of more routine scenario. Now, the upside of this legislation, both in its old form and its current form, is that you can ask for clearance that the rules do not apply, that ultimately there is no tax avoidance motivation. A lot of people would have asked for that clearance potentially as part of the reconstruction process and as part of a number of clearances with the revenue. Again, I suspect a lot of people historically have not even considered it in liquidations and winding up. So much more of a mainstream thing now, and I suppose I could ask you the question, should I ask for a particular clearance from this legislation going forward for liquidations and winding up? I think I'd almost reverse the question and say, why would you not? You clearly don't want potentially a capital gain getting converted back to income many years down the line. And of course, at that stage, you may well be on the back foot and on the defensive to prove to the revenue a negative. It wasn't for tax avoidance purposes. Yeah, but it happened 5 years before. How do you prove it? So clearances in much more mundane situation, I think, is something that people may want to consider. That is an alteration to existing legislation that's been around for many years. And a secondary rule which is being brought in, again, for distributions on or after the same date, 6th of April of this year, is what is being referred to as a targeted anti-avoidance rule. Now, for those who've seen these things before, Any time you see that sort of expression, targeted anti-avoidance, it means the complete opposite. It isn't very well targeted at all and is a bit of a shotgun approach to cover all sorts of things. And what the revenue and the government have done is something similar to what I just talked about, but subtly different. The rules apply, first of all, to winding ups, liquidations and so on, so similar in that context. It applies where the company was a closed company before winding up, where an individual held a 5% stake in that company prior to the winding up. There is a tax avoidance motive again. It is reasonable to suppose that given all the circumstances, what has gone on is a tax motivated transaction. And then the final point, and this is where it's subtly different, and I'm just going to read you something that I've got written down in front of me so we're abundantly clear. So 4 conditions to invoke this legislation, and the consequence is similar. Your capital gain would be reconverted into a distribution, so the same effect as on that £1 million as I mentioned a few minutes ago. So closed company, 5%, tax motivated, and then the final condition. At any time within a period of 2 years, beginning with the date on which the distribution is made. So we have a very clear cut-off here. If what you do is more than 2 years after the date of the original distribution, the rules don't apply. So a kind of arbitrary time limit, but very significant. Or B, if within that 2-year period, the individual carries on a trade or activity which is the same or similar to that carried on by the company. Alternatively, the individual is a partner in a partnership which does the same or similar thing. The third one, the individual or a connected person, which is a very broad term, again, family members, blood relatives amongst others, is a participator in a company which the individual has a 5% stake in and carries on the same or similar. Or finally, and this is very broad, the individual is involved with the carrying on of such a trade or activity by a person connected with them. So effectively what you're saying, if I have 100% of a company, it's a closed company, I wind it up, liquidate it and walk away, but within a 2-year period, do one of those things, either on a self-employed basis or in a partnership, I'm involved in doing a similar or same thing. I'm involved with a family company which is doing the similar thing, and then the big and it's for tax avoidance purposes, then your original capital gain will be converted back to being a distribution. Now, the difficulty with this is the subjectivity and also the fact it is similar in some respects to the transaction in securities rules that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That the big issue with this is that you cannot get a formal clearance to say this legislation does apply. You can for the first set of rules, not for this, which is a bit odd in its own right. However, if you are encountering a liquidation and if you are going to ask for the transaction in securities anyway, part of that clearance is that it is for bona fide commercial reasons, i.e. not tax avoidance. So the slight comfort is if you get the first clearance, although from a slightly different set of rules, one of the conditions is tax avoidance. If the revenue of said tax avoidance doesn't apply for the first transaction, it cannot apply, one would imagine, for the second transaction. Far better though, just within 2 years of winding up liquidating, not to do the same or similar thing. And this is going to be a headache. It is a very subjective set of rules. The revenue have given very little guidance on this. They say they will dream up some examples, but I would have thought the legislation should be clear. The fundamental problem is a very subjective decision, potentially by somebody in the revenue who is there to make money. So the clearances, I think, become even more important. Full clearance from the transaction in securities, that may then have a bit of a comfort value to these rules as well. But certainly clients have got to understand they need to go and play golf for 2 years, I think, is the answer. On that happy note, gives you something to think about, and happy hunting with that, and don't forget your clearances. Thank you very much.